Nicole will be joining us shortly, but I would like to introduce Jasmyn Richardson with us. She is a staff attorney with the Advancement Project, and she's fresh off the battlefield of voting rights litigation with North Carolina's voter suppression law. So, Jasmyn, if you'd like to start, you can tell us a little bit more about that.
Sure, no problem. Can you all hear me? Should I use the mic? I'll hold it. So again, my name is Jasmyn Richardson. I work at Advancement Project. I'm a staff attorney there. Just so you all know, Advancement Project is a next generation multiracial civil rights organization. And what we really do is work with groups on the ground across the country to build up their power, specifically around protecting the right to vote. In my department, I work in the Power and Democracy program. And as Nadia mentioned, I am one of the many lawyers, I think it was about 40 or so, that were working on the voting rights case in North Carolina. That was North Carolina NAACP versus McCrory. We actually just wrapped up a 3-week trial down in North Carolina where many groups were challenging the voter suppression measure, as it's been called by many groups down there. And that was a measure that went into effect in July of 2013, which was right after Shelby being older, which I guess we'll probably get to. And just to give you a little bit of history there, so what was going on? Before House Bill 589, or the voter suppression measure, was passed, many groups on the ground that specifically worked with African Americans, Latino Americans, and young people were using certain election reform measures to get people out to the polls. And those measures were things like early voting, same-day registration, out-of-precinct voting, and pre-registration, specifically in North Carolina. So early voting, I don't know if you have any particular states that you work in, is where people can go to the polls earlier than on election day itself. And in North Carolina, they had a 3-week or 17-day long early voting period, excuse me. Same-day registration was the idea that people could register and vote during the early voting period. So if they missed the registration deadline, which is usually about 25 to 30 days before election day, they could still go and register and vote during the early voting period. And then out-of-precinct voting was the idea that if you were in the right county but wrong precinct, you could still vote for certain positions on the ballot. And then pre-registration, again, in some states is where you can register to vote prior to turning 18, so that you're automatically registered when you turn 18 years old. Anyway, all of those measures were being used in North Carolina in different facets, but disproportionately by African Americans, Latino Americans, and young people. So when House Bill 589 was passed in July of 2013, it then cut back the early voting period. It eliminated same-day registration. It eliminated out-of-precinct voting, and it eliminated pre-registration. It also required photo identification, something we'll probably again get to. I will note, as I should, that since House Bill 589 was passed, the North Carolina General Assembly has passed another piece of legislation which will allow people, if they do not have the required photo identification at the polls, to use what's called reasonable impediment exception. So to say that they had a reasonable impediment why they could not bring their photo ID that day and still be able to vote. And again, we'll get into what that means for North Carolina. That same bill, House Bill 589, also expanded the number of observers and challengers that were at the polls. So that bill was signed on August 12, 2013, and literally within an hour, the North Carolina State Conference, the NAACP, had filed its federal lawsuit in federal district court, challenging that bill under the Voting Rights Act as well as constitutional protections, the 14th and 15th Amendment. Why did they sue? So, to not get too legal and bore you a little bit, and I'm sure we'll get to the provisions of the Voting Rights Act. Basically, they found, or they, being the North Carolina State Conference, the NAACP, as well as other individuals, including students, elderly, as well as churches, were arguing to the court that this particular bill was, one, passed with the intent to discriminate against African Americans, Latino Americans, young people, poor people, because the General Assembly knew that those groups of people were using those reform measures I just described disproportionately. They also argue that it would have discriminatory effect on, again, African Americans, Latino Americans, young people, poor people, because those people had become habituated to using a longer early voting period, same-day registration, out-of-precinct voting, and pre-registration. As I mentioned, the lawsuit is pretty large, complex litigation. It's been combined with other suits that include the League of Women Voters, the ACLU of North Carolina, the Department of Justice, as as well as a group of students who are represented by a firm. Advancement projects in particular represented the North Carolina NAACP and other individuals and churches. So as I mentioned, our clients then were the North Carolina NAACP, churches who had used early voting, same-day registration disproportionately to get members of their church as well as the community out. We also had individual plaintiffs or clients, and those were people like Ms. Rosanelle Eaton, who is 94 years old, and at the time when the required photo identification would have said that she needed to have a photo ID that matched to some degree her voter registration, that was a problem. And the problem was one that's representative of a lot of elderly, specifically African Americans, because a lot of African Americans were not born in public hospitals because they were at times not allowed to be and reported home. They have birth certificates where their names don't really match their names that they've grown up going by. And so there are a lot of discrepancies between names and voter registration and photo ID, and that was their case. We also had student plaintiffs, and that's become a particular issue in North Carolina, as well as on the ground in Texas with the photo ID suit. There you see photo ID requirements for voting that are not the most convenient, I shouldn't say convenient, that are not fair, honestly, to students, because sometimes they don't allow them to use their student IDs and they don't allow them to use their home IDs. So for a student, two students in our case, they were from South Carolina and Georgia respectively and did not have a North Carolina ID, so that meant under the photo identification requirement of House Bill 589, they may not have been able to vote because they wouldn't have had a North Carolina ID, they didn't have a U.S. passport or any other government identification that was for North Carolina or U.S. government ID that would have worked. And that's the case, you see that happening in Texas where there's strict photo ID laws that go into place. So, to wrap up, we have not received a decision yet from the judge. It could come any day now. Most likely it will be appealed up to the Fourth Circuit by either side. For our clients, the utopia, so to say, would be a repeal of the provisions of House Bill 589, federal monitors coming into North Carolina, as well as North Carolina being what we call bailed in, or they would need to go through a pre-clearance requirement, as was the case before Shelby v. Holder. If the case is unsuccessful, this could usher in a lot of voter suppression laws and then cases and litigation that will continue to go on around the country. All eyes are really on North Carolina. We hope to receive a decision any day now.
Thank you. Would you like to discuss a little more in depth the effects that Shelby County had with getting a Section 4 of the Voting Rights Act?
Sure. So Shelby County versus Holder happened around the same time, like I said before, as the law that went into place in North Carolina. And essentially, before Shelby County versus Holder, for several years since the Voting Rights Act in the 60s, there were certain jurisdictions, mostly in the South because of its history, where jurisdictions had to have any voting changes if they moved, sometimes polling places, if they passed laws like this voter ID requirement that's going on around the state, they would have had to get pre-cleared by the Department of Justice because they were a covered jurisdiction under the Voting Rights Act. Essentially, because the law was because you have a history of discrimination against historically African Americans, but also other people of color. When you make these changes, you need to make sure that the plans are sent to DC, to the Department of Justice, and it would be pre-cleared. When Shelby County versus Holder came down, the formula requirement in Section 4 was invalidated. And so that meant Section 5, which said all these jurisdictions that are in the formula, you no longer have to go through pre-clearance. Well, immediately after that, I don't think it's a coincidence that a lot of jurisdictions and states like North Carolina passed these measures that they wouldn't have had to, or they would have had to pre-clear before Shelby County versus Holder. And so a lot of times when you're in panels or you're hearing about voting restrictions or voting rights going around the nation, there's a clear tie to Shelby County versus Holder, because right after that decision came down, then you had a flood of restrictions that came into place, like the one that we saw in North Carolina. And so I do believe that it's had a significant impact on voting restrictions that's come out around the country.
Thank you. I'd like to introduce our next panelist. I'll let her get settled really quickly. Nicole Austin-Hillery is the director of the Brennan Center's Washington, D.C. office. She is their chief liaison to Congress and to the administration. And two areas that she focuses on are voting rights as well as racial justice advocacy. And we're very pleased to have her with us today. We just finished speaking about specifically the North Carolina voter suppression case and the role that Shelby County had and kind of seeing more of these voter suppression laws come out of state legislation. So if you'd like to kind of give us an overview of the current landscape, that'd be great.
Good morning. First of all, my apologies for being late. As my special assistant Allison knows, I hate when people ask me to do anything at 9 o'clock because I live in the suburbs. And I was just saying to my husband on the phone in the car, I was like, why in Washington when there's precipitation does everybody decide they can't drive? I don't know what it is. One of the things I used to, when I first moved to D.C., in my 20s, I had a great apartment on Capitol Hill, and it's mornings like this when I really miss my 20-some-year-old apartment on the hill. But anyway, thank you all for your patience, and thanks for inviting me here this morning. You know, I have to tell you, it's always interesting when we are headed into an election year, because as you know, everyone all of a sudden decides that they want to get really focused on voting. And the thing that I always like to remind people about voting is that it's something that we can't just focus on as we're gearing up for an election year. That there are things, and as you've heard from Jasmyn, there are things that are constantly going on with respect to voting that we need to pay attention to at all times. But particularly within the last 5 to 7 years, because there really has been a war on voting in terms of ensuring that as many Americans as possible have access to the ballot box, have access to easy and effective registration. And this is something we've never seen in the history of this country. The history of this country has always been about actually expanding the ballot, going back to Reconstruction, when former slaves were given the right to vote, going through women's suffrage and women getting the right to vote. Our history has been about expanding the ballot. It has only been in recent history that our country has become one in which forces have worked to make it harder for people to actually register to vote and indeed vote. So because of that, it is important that we stay focused at all times on efforts going on around the country. And the efforts are multifaceted. You've already heard Jasmyn talk about key litigation that is going on, but folks need to understand that really the genesis of this movement happened in the state legislatures. It was at the local level where the first inklings of efforts to suppress the vote really got their start. It was the state legislatures that introduced new types of legislation that did things like attempted to roll back early voting, that attempted to make changes to absentee balloting, that attempted to make changes to citizenship requirements, that wanted to do away with Sunday voting before Election Day. So that is where we are continuing to see so much effort going on is in the states. As a result of the various efforts that happened over the past 2 national election seasons, we are at a point where in 2016, this will be the first time in at least 16 states where we will have new laws in place that those voters had never experienced before. In at least 16 of these states, voters will be dealing with a combination of changes, ranging from new ID requirements to changes in time and place of voting, changes to early voting requirements. So it's going to be key that we monitor and keep track of what the results of these elections are going to be. Not the elections themselves, but what the experience of voters will be. As we know, one of the things that we say at the Brennan Center is the key to ensuring that voters are armed is educating them. That's why we do things like put together the voting loss roundup. That's why we do things like put out reports like what's happening with the voting machines. Because what we found in 2010 and in 2014 was that the more voters knew about these changes, the better prepared they were to ensure that they met all the requirements to actually register to vote and to indeed engage in the election process. So those are the things that we are continuing to push for. We want to make sure that voters know about the changes that exist in their particular jurisdiction, and that's where organizations like yours come in. When you are working with grassroots folks, when you're working with folks around the states, when you're working with community organizations and other national advocacy organizations, it's key to make sure that voters are armed, that they know about these changes. That's the way that they're going to make certain that they are best protected. In addition to that, in addition to what's going on in the states, it is also important to focus on what is happening on Capitol Hill. We all know what happened in Shelby County in 2013. That the Supreme Court gutted Section 4 of the Voting Rights Act, which then basically rendered Section 5 almost moot. We are engaged, many organizations like the Advancement Project, Brennan Center, Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights, and others, we are heavily engaged in trying to get new legislation passed on the Hill to try to restore some of what we lost in the Shelby County decision. But that's a heavy lift. Everybody needs to know that's a heavy lift. The history here on the Hill is that once the Voting Rights Act was passed in 1965, each time it was reauthorized, it was passed and then reauthorized with strong bipartisan support. That's not the environment in which we now find ourselves. We just on the Senate side got the first Republican to co-sponsor the new voting rights bill on the Senate side, and that's only one. Of course, it is a bipartisan sponsored bill on the House side, but it's going to take a groundswell of support from both Democrats and Republicans for us to have any real movement on the Hill. So it is important to continue that bifurcated strategy, to focus on the states, to try to get new legislation passed on the Hill. But certainly the best way to arm voters, to prepare voters, and to ensure continued fair, equal access to the ballot box is to educate voters and to try to protect some of the reform measures that we fought so hard for on the state level.
Great, thank you very much. I will open it up to questions in a moment. But I did want to ask, or to mention, some of the legislation that Nicole's discussing was the Voting Rights Advancement Act of 2015, which provides an updated formula for Section 4, and it provides like a continuously rolling timeline and formula where any state within the past 25 years that's had, I believe it's 10 or 15 violations will be under coverage and be required to seek pre-clearance before changing the voting rights law, or voting law, I'm sorry. But as Nicole mentioned, that is quite a heavy lift at this time. I did want to ask, what are examples of things that state legislatures can do that may not be as heavy of a lift? Like, I know the Brennan Center just did a report on modernizing voting, and how could that expand the ballot without being maybe as heavy of a lift?
Well, I'm glad you brought that up. One of the things that we are pushing for at the Brennan Center is, in fact, efforts to modernize voting and registration on the state level. As important as protecting the Voting Rights Act is, and everyone needs to be clear, that is utterly important, and that is one of our key priorities. But we think that the best way to continue to protect the vote and actually to advance the vote is to try to modernize our election systems in this country. We have an extremely antiquated election system in the United States. For the United States to ostensibly be the world's most advanced democracy, we are way behind some other major democracies in terms of our voting process, in terms of our mechanisms. I was on a panel with Professor Pam Carlin from Stanford, who just recently left DOJ, and she was remarking how, the fact that we still vote the first Tuesday, in November, is based on an agrarian calendar. It was about the fact that the farmers, when they had to, when the crops came and when folks actually could go to the ballot box, that's what we still use to determine when we vote. I mean, that's really antiquated. The machines that we use, as our report talks about, so many of the machines that are in the states are old machines. States are having problems getting the monies to update those machines. So that means we're going to have problems with counting. We're going to have problems verifying ballots. I mean, this is a problem. So one of the ways that we think will help ensure that we can really overcome so many of these barriers is by modernizing our registration system. Automatic registration is probably what most of you are familiar with. You know, the state of Oregon has adopted automatic registration now, most recently the state of California. And the Brennan Center has been working with states across the country to get those states to adopt not only automatic registration, but other components of what we call voter registration modernization. And here's the beauty of modernization and how it works. It has several components, automatic registration being one of them. But under voter registration modernization, it ensures that databases within each state that contain information about citizens, that those databases are actually talking to one another and sharing information, such that once information is in, say for instance, the Department of Motor Vehicles database, that information is then shared with the Election Administration Office. And it's the same information, say for instance, if you are a weirdo like me and you get married and you suddenly become a hyphenated person. A database in the state that says Nicole Austin-Hillery just changed her name will then share that information with the Elections Administration Office. So that therefore, the onus is no longer on the voter to try to keep up with these changes. The onus is no longer on the voter to say, for instance, when they move to another part of a state, to go to that elections office and change their registration. Under voter registration modernization, if you live in one city in a state and you are registered to vote, and then you move to another city. I'm from Pennsylvania, I'm from Harrisburg, but I went to college in Pittsburgh. Under voter registration modernization, if I register in Harrisburg where I grew up and then go to college in Pittsburgh, that will follow me. I will not then have to go to an elections office in Pittsburgh and say, hey, I no longer live in Harrisburg, I live in Pittsburgh, get me updated. Voter registration modernization will ensure that those databases are sharing that information, and the onus then is taken off of the voter and is put on the government. Another, and that's what we call portability, what I just described, when your voter registration information follows you. And that will follow you throughout the course of your life living in that particular state. The only time you then would have to change it is, say, for instance, if you move to a different state. Voter registration modernization also encourages that we use online registration components. Again, these are all things to use the modern technology that we have to make voting more easy and more accessible to voters. So that is something that we are strongly pushing. We have a new report that's coming out on voter registration modernization, so I encourage you to go to our website. We don't have it in hard copy yet, but you can download it electronically. And it is an update on voter registration modernization, and it talks about states that have adopted some components of voter registration modernization, and it talks about the various components so you have a better understanding of it. But that's where we really think the future of modernizing our voting system lies. That's where we think the future of ensuring that we can get as many Americans engaged in the political process and get them on the rolls and cut down on errors. We think modernization is the key to doing that.
That's great, thank you. Are there any questions from the audience at this time? Do you have one this time?
Yeah, I do. Earlier you mentioned, what is this, reasonable impediment, and that seems really subjective, so I'm wondering how that works.
We're wondering too. So, that's a good question, and that's why, without being able to get into it too much, there are negotiations going on about the photo ID provision in North Carolina and what reasonable impediment is going to look like for the voter, to the Board of Elections, to the state and their outreach and education program that's supposed to follow under the law that's created this reasonable impediment exception. And so groups on the ground, mostly led by the North Carolina NAACP, are, to put it softly, investigating or trying to figure out and working with the defendants, who are the State Board of Elections, North Carolina, how the reasonable impediment exception will play out. Because you're absolutely right. A student may not have, or a student may have to prove reasonable impediment exception differently from a older person who goes to the polls. And so it's the hope that they'll all have to face the same set of circumstances, answer the same set of questions, write the same waiver form the same way, and their ballots will be treated differently. Another, I think I would say red flag is that with the reasonable impediment exception, you still vote, but then that's a provisional ballot. Provisional ballots then go to the County Board of Elections, who then determine how your ballot is treated. Well, that could be treated differently in the 100 counties that there are in North Carolina, that's 4 or 5 hours from East Coast to West Coast, East to West. So that all has to be mapped out in advance of 2016 elections. Actually, the primary is going to be in March of 2016. So that's a short time frame to get a reasonable impediment exception kind of ironed out. It may look easy on its face in the statute, but how it plays out is a crucial question for sure.
Hi, my name is Corey Fox. I have a question for Ms. Austin. you mentioned being about, you mentioned how we vote on the first Tuesday in November and being outdated because of the farmer schedule. Do you think there'd be a better way to help more voters be able to vote if we push the day, push the time, maybe made it like on a weekend day? I was wondering what you think about that.
Well, I will tell you, there are various proposals like that are discussed that talk about expanding voting to the entire week, perhaps moving voting to the weekend. The Brennan Center has not taken a position on whether we should move election day. But the thing that we think is feasible, which is something that we currently do, that we think actually should be expanded across the country, which is the early voting options. We think that, again, the modern times in which we live, Americans have different jobs, they have different schedules, they have different responsibilities. It is really crazy to think that everybody is going to be able to vote on that Tuesday between 6 in the morning and 7 at night. So we really strongly advocate for having early voting available in all jurisdictions, because we think that gives voters the greatest opportunity without changing election day to ensure that they have numerous opportunities to vote. But certainly there are some other organizations that are advocating for, there's a group called First Tuesday, and one of the things they talk about is the fact that we need to change that system where we only depend on the first Tuesday of the month. There are also some groups that advocate that we should keep it on Tuesday, but that if we allow online voting, that too would expand opportunities for Americans to vote. That is rife with some other issues. This is putting on the liberty and national security hat that we also wear at the Brennan Center. There are privacy concerns, accuracy concerns. There are also some economic justice concerns with that, because not everybody has a computer, not everybody has high-speed internet, not everybody lives in communities where their libraries have computers or that they can easily access. But those are some of the kinds of other mechanisms that are now being discussed. But we particularly advocate for expanding early voting throughout the country as a way to give as many Americans as possible the opportunity to vote.
Thank you.
Yes,
You talked also about the portability issue with voter registration following someone throughout states, or throughout the state. What do you think about voter registration following them, throughout the country, and just making that something that is already unified, so if someone moves from state to state, that information is shared through those government systems, instead of possibly having to come back in the future, say 10, 15 years, and say, okay, we've spent money on these systems within a state, and now they don't talk to each other, and we don't make it nationwide. Do you have any thoughts on that?
I actually think that is a fabulous idea. I think, however, given that states are so disparate in terms of the computer systems that they use, their state agencies, how they keep documents, how they share information, that is a much heavier lift. I think, on that day of days when everything is copacetic and is as we would like it, that would be fabulous. I just think from a technology standpoint, from a privacy standpoint, from an efficiency standpoint, that would be very, very difficult to do. I mean, gosh, states have a difficult time sharing information about things as minuscule as, you got a ticket in my state, but you live somewhere else. Can you imagine the difficulties and the chaos if we were saying, share information about voter registration? So yes, I think in the best of all possible worlds, that would be fabulous. I just think that's rife with a lot of difficulties, and so I think even thinking about that is a ways off.
in the back, and then.
So you had mentioned that in the Voter Rights Advancement Act, there's a new updated formula. I was wondering if you guys could help talk us through how that formula is different than the one that was in the original section 4.
Well, Jasmyn, do you want me to start?
You can start.
Okay, all right. There's a couple different ways that it's different. Number one of the things that some folks were critical about was the fact that the original Voting Rights Act was limited in terms of the jurisdictions that it impacted. Everyone should know that the original Voting Rights Act was just focused on certain jurisdictions. Those states and those municipalities and counties and voting districts where there had been a history of severe discrimination with respect to voting. So that only covered, some sections of the country, mostly in the South. Some parts of New York, some parts of some other northern states, but mostly it was focused on the Deep South. Well, we know that since 2010, that there have been efforts to introduce legislation that would have the effect of suppressing the vote that have been introduced in places like my home state, Pennsylvania, places like Wisconsin. So there was one of the big criticisms is that this needs to be more expansive. Why is all the focus just still on the historically, southern states where there's been this history of voting discrimination? So the new act, for one, ensures that any bad actor, regardless of the geographic location, would be able to be brought under the provisions of the new Voting Rights Act. That's one. It also, rather than depending on old prior histories of discrimination, focuses more on recent histories. So that if you are in a jurisdiction where there have been more recent acts of voter discrimination, those are the actions that are most emphasized and that you are then being judged by, if you will, rather than looking at what your state or jurisdiction did in terms of being a bad actor 40 years ago or 50 years ago. So those are, to me, those are two of the biggest changes that I think make the bill more expansive, make it more responsive to the kinds of voting discrimination that we are seeing, on the ground, in the 21st century.
I would agree. The only thing I would add is the bail-in expansion. That's huge. So remember before we were talking about what it took for states to be bailed in, or the fact that they're going to now have to go through pre-clearance again. Well, under the Voting Rights Advancement Act, as well as the Voting Rights Amendment Act, which is a former version, you not only can prove that you should be, or a plaintiff can say a state should be bailed in because there was a discriminatory purpose. The legislature acted discriminatorily when they decided that they were going to enact this legislation. That was previously, I will say, the only way that you would get a state bailed back into pre-clearance. Now it's been opened up so that if you prove discriminatory result or effect instead of just purpose, then the state can be bailed in. That's significant because in a lot of litigation going on now, especially in Texas, discriminatory intent is an uphill battle to prove, right? You can see it on your case, you can see it from a lot of circumstantial evidence, as lawyers would like to say, but in the legal standard, it's very hard to prove under the law. Discriminatory results, I won't say is easier, but there's a framework that's a little more conducive to the evidence that's out there. And so I love that part, expanding the bail-in pre-clearance requirement that you can, when you bring a lawsuit, if you prove either discriminatory purpose or discriminatory result, it can result in a bail-in procedure saying that state now has to be bailed in.
Yeah, and that, you're right, Jasmine, that is key, because we know we no longer live in a day and age where people get on the news and say, we just want to keep those black people off the voting rolls. Though there have been some instances recently where the former speaker in Pennsylvania was caught saying that the efforts to introduce some of this new voter ID legislation would ensure that the Republicans would win. But those are smoking guns. Those kinds of things just don't happen. So being able to rely on results versus intent is a huge part of the bill.
Yeah. So I'm from Oregon, and so we do mail-in voting there, and I wonder kind of both your opinions on how that impacts turnout, how discrimination plays in this mail-in.
I think it's certainly a reform that's positive. It opens up the ballot for sure, but I think you have to take it jurisdiction by jurisdiction, right? So in North Carolina, where there is a large African American population, and this is brought out in the courts, we found through evidence, people just testifying, especially in churches, a lot of African Americans don't feel comfortable mailing in their ballots because they're worried that it's not going to count because of the history of being discriminated against, either through registration or going to the polls. They prefer to go in and mail their ballot. So while I think that's a great reform and it opens up the ballot process for sure, it should be pushed, you have to evaluate it by certain jurisdictions and the population and the history. And so in North Carolina, there was the argument from the defendants, well, the photo ID requirement won't be so hard because if you mail in your, or you do an absentee ballot, you don't have to show a photo ID requirement, which is wrought with a lot of problems itself. Why do you need a photo ID when you go to the polls, but you don't need to mail in your ballot? But anyway, aside from that, plaintiffs argued that, well, you can have that exception, except a lot of people of color, especially African Americans, don't feel comfortable mailing in their ballot. So a lot of them are still going to be going to the polls, and that's where the photo ID requirement possibly could still take them. So all that to say, I think it's a positive reform, but you have to take it kind of circumstance by circumstance, that it may not be as positive for certain groups or populations.
And for us at the Brennan Center, again, the issues dealing with privacy, accuracy, protecting the sanctity of the mail-in ballot, those are things that concern us when it comes to vote by mail. Though, as Jasmyn said, we agree that we love to see that it's working so well in Oregon, but for some of the reasons that she mentioned, as well as for some of the privacy concerns, it's something that we're still evaluating, and I'm not certain that it could be as effectively applied across the country.
I'd like to kind of piggyback off that. What's wrong with, like you mentioned, there's a lot of people out there that are worried about their race or religion or whatever being discriminated against for that. What's wrong with setting up like a uniform kind of ballot registration where it leaves, we can do mail-in ballots, but it leaves off, your race and that sort of thing. I realize it would kind of hurt, I guess, not the polls, but how they can say, this majority of people voted this way and that sort of thing, statistics, basically. But what's wrong with using a uniform system where they leave off your things like your gender or your, religion or your race and stuff like that? Because if we mail in that ballot, whoever gets that is just gonna see a name, maybe a party affiliation and who they voted for.
Well, I want to back up because I'm not sure that discrimination occurs just because they're seeing a certain race. I think it's more when they're at the polls that discrimination and challenging can occur there. So, for example, we saw an instance in Michigan, and I think it was 2000, in a community right outside of Detroit. The issue there was a lot of African Americans, Arab Americans, and darker skinned people were being discriminated against, not because of how their name was written on the voter registration form, although that was a subset, just because of how nearly they looked to the poll worker. And it was a group of about 40 people, all Arab Americans, were challenged and made to say an oath to testify to their citizenship. And so the discrimination happened because of how people perceived them, not because of what they were reading. And I do think, and I'm sure Nicole's definitely an expert on this, there are certain limits on exactly what race you put on and how that information is captured. But I think the discrimination happens because people are seeing them first. That's a lot of where I think discrimination starts. Does that answer your question? A little? Maybe Nicole, if you want to.
No, I think that's sufficient. I don't have anything to add.
You and then we'll go to Ryan.
Hi. What would your organization say accounts for the resurgence of these voter suppression ideas?
Well, to put it very frankly, if you look across the country and you look at the states where these new laws have been introduced, they have been in states where they are predominantly either Republicans are in governor's offices, or they are Republican-led majorities in the state legislatures. So it really does appear to be an effort by politicians, mostly in the Republican Party, to try and ensure that the voters who they think are not going to elect their party members have a harder time voting. I mean, it's as simple as that. And I will tell you, some people will say we shouldn't say that, but look, I'm a straight shooter. Everybody in America is smart, and you can do the numbers, you can do the math, and you can see what's going on. That's what's going on. We are a nonpartisan organization, but we like to call it as we see it. And frankly, it looks like it's been an effort by the Republican Party to make it harder for disenfranchised groups to vote. Jasmyn?
And I think to be even more frank, what happened in 2008 and 2012, Black man was elected to the White House, and that brought out in droves more people of color than ever. It was unprecedented. And that happened and carried over into midterm elections, and specifically in North Carolina, I think Barack Obama helped to bring that out, but then it continued. You saw people that don't usually come to the polls, right? Voting, especially in midterm elections, has been secluded, unfortunately, to a generally white, older population. People that have the time to go to the polls, are educated about the process and what it means and how much power it is to vote in the midterm elections, as well as elections in general. And so when that many people were coming out that don't look like the usual people that come out to the polls, aren't the same age as the people that usually come out to the polls, it became a problem. Yes, I think on a partisan level, but also on a racial level, and that's something Advancement Project is unabashed about. There is a racial justice kind of angle to this voting rights and the war on voting. And so I think you saw a lot of restrictions happening, even redistricting happening that has a base of color on it. Problems that, or solutions that are chasing problems, quote unquote fraud, or problems with the electoral integrity that happened at the same time that an African American was first put in the White House, and that is what it is.
Now, I will say, given that, and I agree with Jasmine, it would be interesting to see what might happen should Ben Carson become the Republican nominee. That would be really interesting, given that so much of this effort has been initiated by members of the Republican Party. Then I think we will see an interconnectedness or an interplay, if you will, between the race and partisanship issue. So, in some ways, I'm hoping for that just because I want to see what happens.
Maya, you had a question?
I do. It's really, Jasmine, speaking to the point you just made about solutions chasing problems. I mean, you talked about it, Nicole, by noting that folks don't traditionally come out and say, we'd like to suppress the black vote, therefore. Or the case you cited in Hamtramck, Michigan is rare, and that it was so clear. All of this is really couched in this idea that we are facing massive voter fraud, and we have to respond. Can you speak a bit to that charge that's been in some ways successful, and hence we're having to have the conversation we're having today?
I would say it was successful in the beginning, mitigated now. So that was the justification for photo identification in the beginning, especially we saw that in North Carolina. Since that's come down, just because the statistics don't bear out, right? You have departments that are created to litigate and prosecute election fraud. It's not something that traditionally has happened. I will not say it has never happened, I won't say that. But I will say that it so rarely happens that someone goes to the polls and says, I'm someone who they're not. It just wasn't a problem that was occurring, so much so that you would have to enact a law that burdens people's right to vote so much. And so different justifications now have come into play. Some that do have veracity to them and have to be worked with. You know, it's hard to it's been argued, it's hard to process out of precinct ballots because then you have to kind of match up where they're supposed to be and what poll they were supposed to go to. But I think what's fundamental to remember is you may have some problems, but this is the right to vote, which is a fundamental right to vote under the law and in the Constitution. So when you balance those, our argument is always that should kind of supersede a lot of the problems that are put out there that some don't have a lot of truth to them to begin with.
And the Brennan Center did a report a few years ago called The Truth About Voter Fraud. And we've updated that report and that research. And the bottom line is that in-person voter fraud is rare. And when it does happen, as Jasmine said, we can't say it never happens, but when it does happen, what we found is that it is usually due to administrative misunderstandings. That perhaps a poll worker is giving misinformation to a voter, or that a voter simply doesn't understand certain instructions about where they should be voting. I tell people all the time, we have to remember it is a crime to impersonate another person and go to the ballot box. Of all the crimes, as you heard, I work on criminal justice issues as well at Brennan Center. Of all the crimes that we deal with, I know of no person who willingly says, I'm going to pretend I'm somebody else and go to the ballot box. I don't quite know what you get from that. So it's kind of ridiculous for people to posit that this is such a huge problem. The other factor you have to remember is this. The voter fraud that has been documented is not voter fraud dealing with in-person voter fraud. It's fraud dealing more so with absentee balloting. But yet the people who have been pushing these laws have not at all tried to challenge or deal with making changes to absentee balloting. And again, this goes back to my earlier point in response to the question in the back for the gentleman in the gray suit. Members of the Republican Party are the ones who benefit most from absentee balloting, not people in the Democratic Party. So again, you do the math, you do the reasonable deductions. The other thing, though, I want to caution is this. We've also done, both of our organizations have been engaged in polling research on this idea of voter fraud. I have to tell you, most Americans don't like when we say there's no voter fraud. They just don't. A lot of Americans just believe that, yes, this does exist, and they think logically we should have mechanisms in place to fight against it. So rather than, staying focused on this idea of voter fraud and continuing to say it doesn't exist, we have chosen at the Brennan Center to more so focus proactively on what kinds of reforms can we put in place to ensure that voting is easy, accessible, and accountable for all Americans. That is what resonates more with voters, rather than saying to them, voter fraud just doesn't exist. It's kind of a losing battle. It flummoxes me a little bit, but most Americans just don't want to hear that voter fraud doesn't exist. So I say let's stop wasting time on saying it, and let's focus on what kind of reform measures can we put in place to expand the ballot.
Yes, I was wondering if both of you could speak a little bit more as to why minority groups in particular rely so much on like expanded voting options. And is it something with like gerrymandering or like a lack of polls in the first place for minority groups to get to?
If you could clarify a little bit more when you say why minority groups rely so much on expanded voting options.
Right,
Suss that out a little bit more.
I know you were talking earlier before you got here about why or how disproportionately minority groups are using these expanded measures to make voting easier.
Like same-day registration.
Right. Yeah.
I think it's a hard question because it's, there's so many different layers, but let me start here. I think it's because if you want to expand access, that usually means you're expanding it because some people were not a part of it to begin with, right? So I think, African Americans specifically, let me take that as an example first. I think one, you have the historical perspective if they were not involved in the process. Two, because of historical and social conditions, there are also issues within the voter registration and voting process that makes it harder. So in North Carolina, for example, there was the argument made, I think a good one, that there are still in very rural areas some illiterate African Americans and Native Americans too. People that don't have maybe they do know how to read, but not at a past high school or below high school level. So when you have a process that requires someone to fill out paperwork first, then know, because the paperwork says so, in 30 days you can come to the election. Oh, and you have to wait for a card that comes to your house and read it and tells you where to go to vote. That's a challenging process, right? So same-day registration was good because it became a unified process. There was a county board of elections director from Hope County, a very rural county in North Carolina, who got on the stand and testified that she knew people, and particularly one elderly black man, who she knew that same-day registration had worked for him because he came in, he went to one table, he registered, the person said, go to that ballot box, and he did his ballot. And it became a unified, solidified process. Things like that, registration, pre-registration, where it's, I don't want to say easier for the person, but it makes it more of a accessible process, is something that a lot of you're going to see people of color using because their people historically are out of the process to begin with, and their historical and social conditions that have made the voting process challenging for them. And so you saw a lot of groups, especially in North Carolina, NAACP in North Carolina, of course, using election reform measures like same-day registration especially to advocate, okay, now it's an easier process that you can get someone to poll, more a process that's conducive to time, because you have a lot of African Americans, people of color, poor people who have shifts that do not allow them to get off and just go to the polls. So if you have early voting that includes weekends on Saturdays, that makes it more conducive for them to get to the polls. All of those are kind of wrapped up in what, under the law, are societal and historical conditions that you do have to prove in your Section 2 violations. And that's the reason I think it's used more often and makes it not only convenient but more accessible for people of color. Does that answer your question?
Yes. Thank you.
There are also some impediments that, in terms of logistics that African American voters and voters of color tend to deal with in their communities. For instance, when you look at the number of polling places that exist in minority-dominated communities, There's been some research that has shown that if you look at the population in those communities versus the number of polling places that are available versus looking at a majority community, they don't seem to be equal. There seem to be far more polling places available in communities that perhaps are less populated, but that are better populated by majority members and people from more economically well-off communities than there are in African American and other brown communities. So even logistically, those kinds of problems make it harder, such that having more expansive opportunities, early voting days, longer periods of voting days, those are things that therefore help to balance out those logistical problems that tend to be faced more heavily in Black and brown dominated communities.
I wanted to delve a little bit more into photo identification, which we've heard from both Jasmyn and Nicole. Can you both elaborate more on why photo identification is an issue in suppressing the right to vote? And I'm also interested if someone can speak to how it impacts student voters as well.
Well, let me start by saying this. And the head of the Brennan Center, our president, if you hear him talk about photo ID, he will say this. I don't necessarily agree with him, and we have sometimes internal discussions about this. I'm one of those people who thinks we don't need photo ID at all. I don't think it serves a purpose. Our president will say, and this is a valid point, that the problem with photo ID is not simply that you are requiring it, it is the parameters around photo ID that are a problem. And here's what I mean. Every one of us has some kind of ID on us with a photo, or some kind of ID period that says who we are, whether it has a photo or not. You may have a check cashing card. You may have a card that says you belong to the ABCD Community Center, and this is where you live. We all have some kind of ID on us that says who we are. When states say, you know what, we are only going to accept certain kinds of ID and photo ID, you are therefore limiting the kinds of ID that voters can present to you. And what we have found is that voters in Black and brown communities are disproportionately impacted when a jurisdiction is saying we only want photo IDs and photo IDs of a certain kind. Perhaps photo ID that only has been issued by the government versus the one that was issued by your bank versus the one that was issued by the local check cashing agency in your community. That is the problem. If states were to say, we will accept any kind of ID that tells us who you are, whether it has a picture or not, that would be harder to argue against. But what so many of these states have done is they have certain parameters. Those parameters are limited, and what we have found is that the parameters that they have in place disproportionately impact Black and brown communities, the elderly, and students, and other young people, because those people tend to have less access to the kinds of IDs that states are saying they require. That is the key problem with asking for photo identification.
Not much to add to that, but very succinctly, I will say, as many people are quick to point out, and this goes back to Nicole's point of partisanship kind of tied up in racial politics. In Texas, as an example, you can use an ID for your handgun, but you cannot use a student ID, right? That's kind of wrapped up in a lot of politics there. And so that's why students particularly see this as a war on their voting rights, because why can't I use, especially, I think if it's a public issued state ID, if it came from the University of Texas, which is a public school, why couldn't they use that, but they could use a handgun ID? And so that became a talking point and very much a problem in Texas and North Carolina, where you have these strict photo ID requirements, that photo ID is now becoming wrapped up in politics.
I did have, yes, go ahead.
Both of you have mentioned these regressive voter suppression laws that have been passed in numerous states, and that in almost every case, the effort has been led by a Republican majority in the state legislature, or a Republican in the governor's mansion, or in the Secretary of State's office, and how important it is for us to work with state representatives to try to repeal these laws or pass new laws. But I'm wondering, what's in it for them, right? If the idea or the belief is that they're passing these laws because it benefits them, for what reason should they work with organizations like the Advancement Project or the Brennan Center to repeal these laws or pass new laws?
Well, and at a most basic level, these are lawmakers who take oaths to represent the citizenry of their jurisdictions, particularly if you're the governor, particularly if you're the Secretary of State. So, as part of your duties as an elected official, your job is to protect the interests of all of the citizens in your jurisdiction. So, to be directly engaged in efforts that have a discriminatory impact on certain portions of your community, that really violates your duties ethically as a lawmaker, as a representative, as an official that represents the citizens in that community. So that's one of the things that we talk to individuals about. Secondly, we try to appeal to just doing the right thing. As a lawmaker, as someone who represents citizens, your job should not be about making it harder for anybody within your jurisdiction. It should be about making it harder for them to engage in the political process, in our democracy. That is what our country is supposed to be about. It's supposed to be about helping people to engage in our democracy. So those are some of the arguments that we use. But I will tell you that for me, as someone who used to work in the state legislature, it's all about strategy. I truly believe there are some people you're just not going to convince. These are politicians. There are some people there for whom there is nothing we can say to them to make them believe that it is politically expedient for them to not engage in trying to move these measures, because they will look at the numbers and they will say, yes, this is a way for us to win. So to some degree, you have to put those people aside and you have to focus on the proactivity. Focus on those folks, those members within the legislature who can actually support protecting voters and helping them to strategize and figure out how do they reach some of the few members of that other party who believe that the right thing is to protect voters. And again, it's about political strategy and those folks working together to try to overcome barriers that are being put up by the other side who are trying to make it harder. But otherwise, and I will tell you truthfully, again, as I said, I'm a straight shooter. If I were a Republican and I wanted to keep black and brown people away from the polls, it's brilliant to come up with some of this stuff. It just is. It is not in their interest to make voting expansive. But though, here is what I also say to my Republican friends when I talk to them, and again, we are a nonpartisan organization, and this is me, Nicole, basing this on my experience as someone who's worked in the state legislature and worked in policy for a long time. I think any party should be about trying to expand the number of people that are interested in their party. And to me, part of what the Republican Party has been doing is really turning voters away from their party and from wanting to be engaged in their party. And to me, that is the overarching issue. That really works against their political interests. And if I were a strategist advising them, I would say the better thing to do is to focus on getting some of these unlikely supporters more interested in your party. And the way that you don't do that is by enacting laws that keep some of them, people in their groups, away from the polls.
Completely agreed, and the only thing I would add is that you can tell them you can use it too. Like in North Carolina, it just so happened around the time of Obama and a little bit before that they started galvanizing people. This goes back to your point around these certain measures, but actually I think it was early voting that was disproportionately used by whites at one point. So I think what happened was they used it, maybe tapped out on these reform measures, and then African Americans, Latinos, young people, poor people started using it as well and were able to exploit it, so to say, just a bit more. But early voting can work for both sides, right? Early voting works regardless of your race for elderly people who are at certain homes and need a bus ride to get, or transportation to get to the polls, if they have more time to do it, and that doesn't depend on race, that just is an age factor and it could appeal more to Republican members, then you can use early voting to bolster your particular party getting to the polls. So, it can be used more and by both sides, it's just who used it more, and we saw the repercussions of that.
You can go ahead. Sure.
My question is on automatic voter registration. I think Oregon brought the discussion register their voters. What are the justifications for doing that resonate? What has been the reaction to that measure on both sides of the issue?
Well, some of the arguments that resonate are this. States like Oregon that adopt automatic registration, and even some states that have been exploring it, have been able to show that it's a cost-saving measure for their states. That they spend less money on election administration as a result of automatic registration, because people, again, are put on the rolls. It happens when they go to DMV or some of the other agencies, and that cuts down on a lot of administrative costs. So that's a big thing, particularly in this day and age when we know that state legislatures are strapped across the board, and they're very concerned, fiscally concerned about how dollars are being spent. That's number one. Number two, what we found is automatic registration also ensures better accuracy in terms of making sure that information about individual voters is up to date and is accurate. Again, because it uses a state database like a DMV database to provide information on the voter. This is information that voters are themselves helping to get inputted on site, say for instance when they go to update their motor vehicle registration. So the number of instances where we have inaccurate information has been cut down drastically. And so states have been saying this is the thing we want. We want fewer errors. And again, that deals with the voter fraud issue too. If you have fewer errors, that means and information is more up to date, that means the propensity to have any kind of fraudulent issue raised is lessened. So those are two of the biggest things. And again, California has seen the light and sees that they think this is effective as well. And we're really hopeful and have been working with other states. We think a lot of other states are going to come on board with automatic registration. And I will also tell you this, that there is no legislation out right now, but I do know that some of the offices here on the Hill are also looking further into automatic registration and figuring out what can be done on the federal level to try to encourage the use of automatic registration throughout the country.
Thank you.
We've already talked a little bit about voter fraud, but I did want to kind of bring up the other end of the spectrum, which is voter intimidation. I served as a voter advocate in the last presidential election in Virginia, and one of the things they trained us to look out for were any instances where we thought a voter was being intimidated or could feel intimidated. Has this been an issue that either of you have seen through research that's been kind of a widespread problem?
Definitely. So, sorry, keep going back, but in North Carolina and other places where you see an increase of observers and challengers at the poll, I think that's tied directly to some, again, racial undertones that are going on, specifically in the Latino community. There is this rhetoric that's being sustained that there are illegals going to the polls to vote, which, I mean, if you are trying to stay under the radar, I don't think the best way to do that would be to go to vote. That's just Jasmyn's opinion. But you see this same, it's almost just like voter fraud, this same rhetoric that's being sustained in different communities, and it's so much so that it's bubbling up to a legislative level where you feel that you need to enact policy that increases the number of challengers and people that are watching you at the poll. How that plays out specifically in the Latino community or in a case like in Michigan, that becomes an easy way to target certain populations based on fear that goes on around the country. And that's definitely happening in North Carolina. A lot of times people of color, I will say the effect, particularly on the African American community, is for a community that has a history of dogs being put on them just because they were going to register to vote. The idea that someone's going to be at the polls to check to make sure you're going to be there does not play out so well with the African American community, regardless if that's the intent of it. So definitely seeing the number of outside third-party groups that are at the polls to monitor those who are coming in, and definitely seeing an uptick of legislation that's particularly implemented to quote-unquote keep people who should not be going to the polls there. And it's a problem.
Have we seen like large numbers of voter challengers show up at the polls? I know I've read stories about third-party groups. The specific poll I was at had a couple different issues, but I was expecting loads of challengers to come in for that. But has that been an issue that you've seen in North Carolina specifically, where people are coming to challenge?
Yes, Voter Integrity Project and True to Vote, third party groups are very big on protecting the ballot box. And interestingly, what happens then you have people on both sides, right? The people that are there to challenge, people are there to make sure that you don't have people to challenge. And so you're having I should say entourage, but a huge group of outsiders at the polls. And for a process that's supposed to be, pretty not just easy, but something that you look forward to doing. And as an American, it's become wrought with a huge contentious environment, which is not positive for the voting process.
Before we wrap up, I wanted to ask folks if there's any kind of parting words we can leave about any legislation that the Brennan Center specifically is tracking, or that the Advancement Project is specifically tracking, that would expand access and kind of leave on a more positive note.
Jasmyn?
Oh, sure. So I will say that one of the biggest victories we've seen is in Pennsylvania with online voter registration. That was huge because the Advancement Project has had a presence in Pennsylvania, specifically on a photo ID law. So to see not a restrictive measure, but a positive online reform that's modern, as Nicole pointed out, was a huge victory that we were happy to see.
And for those of you who picked up our document, Voting Laws Roundup 2015, because I am a glass half full person, if you look on the third page of our document, the list of bills that were defeated in 2015 is longer than the list of restrictive bills that were passed. There's only one restrictive bill that was passed in 2015 that we've listed here. It's from North Dakota. But there are several states where the effort to defeat restrictive bills has been very successful. So that's one thing people need to keep in mind. We actually are right now winning the battle to stop the introduction and passage of some of these restrictive bills. But then number two, again, the Brennan Center has been advising and giving research and information to offices on the Hill that have reached out to us and said, we really want to look at voter registration modernization. So I go back to my earlier point. Yes, we have to continue to protect, and we are all watching and monitoring and supporting the current voting rights legislation, the legislation that would make, that would restore what we lost in Shelby County. But I think, and we think at the Brennan Center, that the future is about modernizing the voter registration system. That if we can do that, that would change really the playing field on voting. That would expand the access to more Americans. It would make it easier for people to vote. And it would make it more accurate and more cost-effective for the states. So I think that is a positive reform measure. The fact that we have states like Oregon and California and other states looking into that, I think that's exciting. And I think we're going to see more movement when it comes to modernizing our voting system. And I think that's probably going to be one of the most key things we can do going forward to help ensure that as many Americans as possible are engaged in the voting process.
Thank you. I wanted to leave on this note. Yesterday, I had the privilege, along with other Arab Americans in Pennsylvania, to meet with the Pennsylvania Secretary of State, Pedro Cortes, and he was discussing the new online voter registration system, and he left us with a story about how he has framed in his office a ballot that the Iraqis used. When you saw images of the ink-stamped fingers that everybody was so proud of and was rolled up and they were purple. And he mentioned how, in other countries, people walk miles upon miles to be able to vote. And it kind of brought home the sense that 50 years ago is not that long ago to have fought that battle in the United States for many people. And so I know this is the 50th anniversary, but I did read somewhere that Congress shouldn't just commemorate, that they really need to legislate. So I just wanted to kind of leave on that note that we have a lot of work to do. So hopefully we'll do good work.
Thank you.